Two young National Guard members standing watch in our own capital never made it home. They weren't deployed overseas. They weren't in a war zone. They were patrolling the streets of Washington, doing the job they swore an oath to do, when a man stepped from around a corner and opened fire. In the blink of an eye, two families were shattered. Two uniforms hit the pavement, and millions of Americans stopped and asked themselves the same question: how did this happen here? But what came next is what truly stunned the country. Because within hours, investigators confirmed that the shooter wasn't just another criminal. He was an Afghan national who entered the U.S. during the chaotic 2021 evacuation and whose asylum was approved earlier this year. That revelation set off a shockwave, and President Donald Trump responded with one of the most forceful, uncompromising statements we've heard in years, calling the attack an act of terror, demanding a full review of every Afghan brought in under the Biden administration, and announcing immediate security measures for the capital. This is where our story begins today, with two Americans who paid the ultimate price, and a nation suddenly forced to confront a question it hoped it would never face again. Did a failure in our vetting system lead to an American tragedy? Let's break down what happened, what Trump announced, and what this moment means for the safety and future of the United States. Picture this. It's a day like any other in Washington. Two members of the West Virginia National Guard are on patrol, fulfilling their duty to protect the nation's capital. They're doing exactly what they signed up to do, defending America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And then, without warning, a man comes around a corner and opens fire. Both guards are struck, both critically wounded. The attack was swift, brutal, and according to early reports, premeditated. This wasn't a random act of violence or a confrontation that escalated. This was an ambush, a calculated assault on two Americans who had dedicated themselves to serving their country. The attacker was shot by responding forces and taken into custody. He survived. He's not cooperating with authorities. But investigators moved quickly, and what they uncovered sent shockwaves through the entire federal government. Now, here's where I need your full attention. The suspect wasn't just anyone. He wasn't a citizen who'd fallen through the cracks of mental health services or a criminal with a long rap sheet. He was a foreign national from Afghanistan, and he entered the United States legally. Let that sink in for a moment. Legally, he arrived in September of 2021 on one of those emergency evacuation flights everyone was talking about when Afghanistan fell. You remember those chaotic scenes at the airport in KBLA? Thousands of people rushing the tarmac, planes taking off overloaded, the desperation, the urgency, the sense that America had a moral obligation to get our allies and partners out before the country completely collapsed under the weight of the situation. And so we brought people in, tens of thousands of them, under what was called Operation Allies Welcome. It was framed as a humanitarian mission, a rescue operation for those who had helped American forces during 2 decades of conflict. Interpreters, support staff, people who risked their lives working alongside our military. But here's the question nobody wanted to ask at the time, and the question that's now front and center. How many of those people were actually vetted? How many were interviewed one-on-one? How many had their backgrounds checked against terrorist databases, criminal records, or any kind of meaningful standard? According to the information now coming out, this particular individual was granted asylum earlier this year. His status, which had been temporary, was extended under legislation signed during the previous administration. So, he wasn't just here temporarily, he was here with legal protection. The system had reviewed his case and said, yes, you can stay. And then he allegedly ambushed 2 National Guard troops in broad daylight. Now, if you're like most Americans, you're probably asking yourself, how does this happen? How does someone who entered the country under a program designed to protect allies end up attacking the very people sworn to defend that country? That's the question President Trump addressed in a video statement released just hours after the attack. And let me tell you, it was one of the most forceful, unfiltered responses we've seen from any sitting president in recent memory. He didn't mince words. He didn't soften the message. He called it exactly what he believed it was, an act of evil, an act of hatred, an act of terror. He described the attacker as an animal who would pay the steepest possible price. He spoke directly to the families of the wounded guardsmen, offering prayers and support, But then he pivoted, and this is where the policy implications become impossible to ignore. He said, based on the best available information, that the suspect is a foreigner who entered our country from Afghanistan, a place he described in stark terms. He went on to say, the individual was flown in under the previous administration, during those infamous flights, where, in his words, nobody knew who was coming in, nobody knew anything about it. And then came the statement that's now dominating every news cycle, every political conversation, and every dinner table discussion across America. He said, this attack underscores the single greatest national security threat facing our nation. That the last administration let in tens of millions of unknown and unvetted foreigners from all over the world, from places most people don't even want to think about. Now, whether you agree with that characterization or not, the point he's making is clear. There is a direct line, in his view, between lax immigration enforcement, insufficient vetting procedures, and incidents like this one, and he's not alone in that belief. Millions of Americans, particularly those in the senior community who value stability, order, and national security, are nodding their heads. Because let's be honest, when you hear that, someone who is supposed to be rescued, someone who is supposed to be grateful for the opportunity America gave them turns around and attacks American service members, it raises fundamental questions about judgment, process, and priorities. Trump went further. He didn't just criticize. He announced action. He said every single individual who entered the country from Afghanistan under the previous administration would now be re-examined. Every case, every file, every background check, and if there's any indication that someone doesn't belong here, doesn't add benefit to the country, or can't demonstrate love for America, they will be removed. He framed it not as cruelty, but as responsibility. If they can't love our country, we don't want them. To some, that sounds like common sense. To others, it sounds like xenophobia. But regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, the policy shift is real, and it's happening fast. And it didn't stop there. In the same address, Trump announced he was mobilizing an additional 500 troops to protect the Capitol, not as a symbolic gesture, as an actual deployment. More boots on the ground, more security presence, more visible reassurance to the American people that their government is taking threats seriously. He said, America will never bend and never yield in the face of terror, that the mission these service members were fulfilling would not be deterred, that safety, order, and sovereignty would be restored. And he made it clear the perpetrator would face swift and certain justice, adding, almost as a side note, if the bullets going in the opposite direction haven't already done that. Now, while Trump was delivering that message, another narrative was forming in the media. And this is where things get complicated, because depending on which channel you turned on, you got a completely different story. Some outlets focused on the tragedy itself, the heroism of first responders, the prayers for the wounded Godsmen, the solidarity of the military community, but others, particularly on networks like MSNBC, took a very different angle. They questioned whether the National Guard should have been in Washington at all. They suggested that Trump's decision to deploy troops for his administration's crime crackdown created the conditions for this attack. They asked whether military personnel were being used as political props and whether their presence was actually making the city less safe, not more. One commentator even read a statement Trump had posted on social media about elections in Honduras, implying that the president was distracted, unfocused, or indifferent to the crisis at hand. The framing was clear. Trump is reckless, his policies are dangerous, and this attack is in some way his fault. Isn't that crazy? But here's what that narrative ignores. And this is important. So, stay with me. The suspect didn't attack those guardsmen because they were standing on a street corner. He attacked them because allegedly he wanted to commit an act of violence against representatives of the United States government. The presence of troops didn't create the threat. The failure to properly vet the individual who became the threat, that's what created the danger. And that's the point Trump keeps hammering home. This isn't about where the troops should be deployed. It's about whether we know who we're letting into the country in the first place. So, let's talk about vetting, because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where policy, process, and reality collide in ways that most people never see until something goes tragically wrong. During the Afghanistan withdrawal, the United States evacuated somewhere between 70 and 100,000 people in a matter of weeks. It was one of the largest and fastest humanitarian airlifts in modern history. And it was chaos, absolute chaos. There were people rushing planes. There were reports of individuals being waved through checkpoints without documentation. There were concerns that some evacuees had no verifiable connection to American forces or operations. Commanders on the ground later testified that there wasn't enough time or resources to conduct thorough individualized interviews for every person who boarded a flight. The priority was speed. Get people out before the situation deteriorated further. Worry about the details later. But later is now, and the details matter. Trump's administration, back during his first term, had a program called the Special Immigrant Visa Process. It was designed specifically for Afghan and Iraqi nationals who had worked with U.S. forces. It required extensive background checks, biometric data, interviews, references from American personnel, and a multi-year vetting timeline. It was slow, it was bureaucratic, but it was thorough. When the evacuation happened under the next administration, that process was bypassed. Instead, people were brought in under humanitarian parole, a temporary status that allows entry without the same level of scrutiny. The idea was that vetting could happen after arrival once people were safe. But did it? That's the question Congress tried to answer. Oversight committees requested data. How many people came in? Where are they now? Have they been fully vetted? What systems are in place to monitor them? And, according to testimony that's now part of the public record, officials couldn't provide clear answers. One official said they were proud of Operation Ally's welcome. Another admitted they didn't have exact numbers. A military commander said individuals were not interviewed on a case-by-case basis during the initial intake. So, here we are, tens of thousands of people admitted to the United States under emergency conditions. Some fully deserving of refuge. Some who genuinely risked their lives for America, but also potentially some who slipped through the cracks. Some whose motives were never questioned. Some whose backgrounds were never verified, and one of them allegedly just ambushed 2 National Guard troops. Now, if you're an American watching this, you might be thinking about your own life, about the world you grew up in, about the values you were taught, self-reliance, responsibility, the belief that America was a place of order, not chaos, a place where the government's first job was to protect its citizens. And here's what I want you to know. This moment, as painful and confusing as it is also an opportunity. An opportunity to demand better, to expect accountability, to insist that compassion and security are not mutually exclusive. Because what we're witnessing right now isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern, a series of decisions made over years that prioritize speed over safety, politics over process, and optics over outcomes, and the consequences are real. Consider the data that's been coming out about violence against law enforcement. According to the National Fraternal Order of Police, in the months leading up to this incident, close to 300 officers were shot in the line of duty. Nearly 40 of them were killed, and there were close to 60 ambush-style attacks, nearly 20 of which resulted in fatalities. These aren't just statistics. These are fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, people who put on a uniform every day, knowing the risks but believing in the mission. And when you add to that the fact that attacks on ICE officers have increased more than 10-fold in a single year, jumping from fewer than 20 reported assaults to well over 200, you start to see a disturbing trend. People are being told directly or indirectly that law enforcement is the enemy, that immigration enforcement is cruelty, that protecting borders is racism. And when you repeat that message long enough, loud enough, through enough channels, some people start to believe that violence against those officers is justified. One woman in a video that went viral after the attack said she wasn't surprised 2 National Guard members were shot. She said, "When you declare war on people based on racism and hate, what do you expect?" She implied. The violence was a natural response to Trump's policies. Let that sink in for a moment. She's suggesting that enforcing immigration law is equivalent to declaring war, and that attacking American service members is an understandable reaction. That's not political disagreement. That's radicalization. And it's exactly the kind of rhetoric that Trump and his supporters argue is creating a dangerous environment where people feel emboldened to attack anyone associated with enforcement or security. Now, on the other side of the political spectrum, You've got lawmakers who were already under investigation for encouraging military members to disobey orders. A group of Democratic Congress members, including some military veterans, released a video before this attack, telling service members they have a duty to refuse what they called illegal orders from the president. The video featured high-ranking former military officials. It was polished, professional, and on its face, it sounded reasonable. After all, the military does teach that you should never follow an illegal order. That's a bedrock principle going all the way back to the Nuremberg trials after World War II. Following orders is not a defense if those orders are unlawful. But here's the problem. The video didn't specify what orders were illegal. It just implied that Trump might issue them, and that soldiers should be ready to refuse. It created a cloud of suspicion around lawful commands without providing any concrete examples. And now, after the attack, the Justice Department has opened an investigation into whether that video constitutes sedition or an attempt to undermine military discipline. They have reached out to the lawmakers involved, requesting voluntary interviews. One of them, a former Navy officer who now serves in Congress, went on CNN and said he would refuse to sit down for a voluntary interview. He called it political persecution. He said he was simply reminding troops of their constitutional obligations, but he's also fundraising off the controversy, sending mass texts, asking supporters to chip in so he can fight back against what comes next. So on one hand, you've got a president saying the system failed to protect Americans. On the other hand, you've got lawmakers saying the president himself is the threat. And caught in the middle are the men and women in uniform who just want to do their jobs without being turned into political pawns. It's messy, it's divisive, and it's exactly the kind of situation that leaves everyday Americans feeling exhausted and confused. But here's what I want you to understand. Beneath all the noise, beneath the partisan talking points and the cable news shouting matches, there is a real policy question that deserves a serious answer. How do we balance compassion for refugees with security for citizens? It's not an either-or proposition. It's possible to be both humane and vigilant, but it requires something we've been in short supply of lately: competence. Competence means having systems in place to properly vet people before they enter the country. It means not cutting corners when lives are at stake. It means acknowledging that some countries, particularly those without functioning governments or reliable record-keeping, present unique challenges that require extra scrutiny. Afghanistan is one of those places. For over 2 decades, it's been an active conflict zone. Its government collapsed. Its institutions are nearly non-existent. There are no centralized databases to check someone's background against, no reliable way to verify work history or personal references, which means that when you bring someone in from that environment, you're taking a risk. Now, that doesn't mean everyone from Afghanistan is dangerous, but it does mean that a blanket approach, a one-size-fits-all emergency evacuation, without robust follow-up, creates gaps. And gaps create risk. And risk, when it's not managed, can turn into tragedy. Trump's directive to re-examine every Afghan entrant isn't about demonizing an entire population. It's about closing those gaps. It's about saying, we made decisions in a crisis, and now we need to review those decisions with clear eyes and make sure we didn't miss something that could endanger American lives. Whether you think that's reasonable or reactionary probably depends on your broader view of immigration and government responsibility. But let's zoom out for a second, because this incident, as significant as it is part of a much larger conversation about what kind of country America wants to be moving forward. Trump has made it clear that his administration's priority is security, not just military security, but societal security. The idea that Americans should be able to walk down the street, send their kids to school, go to work, and trust that their government has taken reasonable precautions to keep them safe. That means stronger borders. It means more rigorous vetting. It means deporting people who entered illegally or who violate the terms of their stay. And it means not apologizing for putting American citizens first. His critics argue that this approach is inhumane, that it ignores America's history as a nation of immigrants, and that it uses fear to justify policies that disproportionately harm vulnerable populations. They point to families separated at the border, asylum seekers turned away, and communities living in fear of ICE raids. They say the real threat to America isn't coming from refugees. It's coming from leaders who exploit fear for political gain. Both sides have evidence to support their arguments. Both sides have stories that tug at the heartstrings. And both sides believe genuinely that they're fighting for the soul of the nation. But here's what I think gets lost in the middle of all that. Most Americans don't want cruelty. They also don't want chaos. They want a system that works. A system that's fair, transparent, and effective. They want to be able to help people in need without putting their own families at risk. And they want leaders who can deliver that balance without resorting to demonization or virtue signaling. Right now, we don't have that. What we have is a political environment where every issue is turned into a weapon, where nuance is seen as weakness, and where the loudest voices drown out the most thoughtful ones.